Hello there. Have you ever noticed how many passages there are in the Bible about people or things that seem to definitely be dead, and then suddenly they're not? Like there's that dead guy in Second Kings who gets dumped into Elisha's grave, and then as soon as his body touches the bones, boom, he comes back to life again. There's the wild beast in Revelation 17 that existed, and then it died, and then it comes back to life. There's the two prophets in Revelation 11 that lie dead on the street for 3.5 days, and then they suddenly pop up again, good as new. And then besides those, you got all the actual resurrections of dead people in the Bible. I think the key is having a good miracle guy.
Look who knows so much, huh? Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead.
So, where are we going with this? Well, when Anthony Morris was announced as no longer being on the governing body last year, I think a lot of people were doing the ding dong the witch is dead dance. But have we seen the last of him? Or will he rise again?
You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
So in this video, I want to explore that idea that, well, to most people, it was a big humiliation that Anthony Morris is no longer on the governing body. There are other witnesses to whom he might be really a hero for standing his ground against a governing body that seems to be making a lot of unexpected changes in the organization. I think there's probably a good number of old school witnesses who disagree that beards should be allowed for men, or that witnesses don't need to turn in time anymore. In fact, they might be wondering, is the governing body going rogue? Are they becoming apostates, essentially, trying to lead Jehovah's organization down a false path? And so, if that's the reason that Anthony Morris is off the governing body, because he stood his ground and refused to go along with the rest of them, it kind of makes him a hero to witnesses with that mindset. In fact, could it even lead to a schism in the organization or splinter groups forming, with the more progressive witnesses sticking with the current governing body, and then the more conservative witnesses coalescing around Anthony Morris as maybe the true representative of Jehovah? So that's kind of the hypothesis for this video. My plan is to first actually talk about what's going on in Mormonism, because I think that gives us clues as to what could happen among Jehovah's Witnesses. So we'll kind of check out first what's been going on there. Spoiler, some really crazy stuff. And then we'll come back and kind of draw parallels to the Watchtower organization. Okay, so if you follow true crime podcasts maybe, or just national news, you may have heard about a couple named Chad and Lori Daybell. They're a Mormon couple from Idaho. They're also murderers, by the way, who left a trail of dead bodies in their wake. Now, they met each other in 2018 while each of them was married to their respective spouses still, and they quickly formed a relationship with each other. In February 2019, Lori's husband filed for divorce from her, citing threats to his life, as well as Lori having stolen his truck and also $35,000 from their joint bank account. In July 2019, he was shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex, who claimed at the time self-defense. Lori was later indicted for a conspiracy to murder him. In October, Chad's wife died. Initially, it was assumed to be from natural causes, but was later determined to be from asphyxiation. Chad, at the time, received $430,000 in a life insurance payout from her death. Then in December, Lori's brother died suddenly, although for the moment that has been ruled to be due to natural causes. But anyways, after the life insurance payout, Lori and Chad abandoned their houses in Idaho and they moved to Hawaii. They got married there 2 weeks after Chad's wife died. Now, what we haven't mentioned up until this point is that Lori had 2 children, Tylee, age 16, and JJ, age 7. In Hawaii, Chad and Lori were telling people that they had no children. As far as extended family back home, they told them that the kids were with family friends down in Arizona. However, JJ's grandmother became kind of suspicious after a while, and eventually both kids were declared missing by the police. And long story short, their bodies were eventually found buried on Chad's property. They were found in June 2020. 7-year-old JJ had his arms and legs bound with duct tape. His mouth had been duct taped shut, and he was then asphyxiated with a plastic bag over his head. They found scratch marks on his neck, indicating he had fought for his life to get the bag off his head. 16-year-old Tylee's body had been burned, charred, and then dispersed on the property, making it actually impossible to tell her exact cause of death. The forensic pathologist received her remains in 3 separate bags. Injuries to her bones were noted, indicating that they had tried to dismember her body before burying the burned bones and organs. In July 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty of both murders and was sentenced to 2 life sentences in prison. Chad's trial begins in April 2024. So this is all very horrifying, but what does it have to do with Jehovah's Witnesses? Well, what we're going to see is that there is a good number of Mormons that have become kind of bored or dissatisfied with mainstream Mormonism, or they kind of feel that the current church leaders have maybe taken the church in a direction away from where it should be. And they've also gotten more and more interested into doing their own research into the more apocalyptic or end-times theology of the religion. And I think what we'll start to see is that we can find parallels in the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses. There's some witnesses who are finding the religion maybe a little boring, a little too mainstream these days. And they might disagree with some of those decisions that the governing body is making about beards and not turning in time and things like that. They dislike this direction that the governing body seems to be taking the religion. And some have become interested in doing more of their own research and kind of deciding for themselves what various Bible passages means. Now, to begin with, let's kind of look at what the official church doctrine of the Mormon or the LDS religion is about end times theology. So Chad and Lori actually met each other because they circulated in similar Mormon circles that were discussing, we might even say obsessed with, end times theology. Now, mainstream Mormonism does have a doctrine of end times theology, although you don't hear about it too much. In fact, that's the Latter-day part of the full name of the religion, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I apologize in advance if I'm getting anything wrong that I'm going to say about LDS theology. It's a little complicated. But the LDS Church teaches that Jesus will soon return to set up New Jerusalem in the city of Independence, Missouri, in the United States. In fact, the LDS Church has long owned property in Independence for this purpose. They own more property about 50 miles north of that, a site which Joseph Smith, the first LDS prophet, called Adam Andi Amen. LDS doctrine states that this site is where Adam and Eve lived after being expelled from the Garden of Eden, which Smith reportedly taught was also in Missouri. Who knew? Now, while witnesses and really most Christian denominations teach that Adam of Adam and Eve was a bad guy, the LDS Church actually teaches that Adam is a pretty good guy. They say that when the Bible talks about Michael the archangel, well, that is actually Adam before he came to earth. And his eating the forbidden fruit was actually just part of the plan of salvation for everybody. After his death, Adam became a god, and he will soon return to Missouri to convene a gathering of thousands of faithful believers so that they can kind of get everything set up for Jesus' second coming, which will happen shortly afterwards. So don't get me wrong, the LDS Church absolutely teaches that members should be ready and prepared for those end times, which will kick off Jesus' second coming. And they believe there will be all the disasters that witnesses are familiar with from Matthew 20:14 in the last days: earthquakes, wars, food shortages, pestilences. Most Mormons have at least a year's supply of food and other necessities stored in their houses. In fact, the LDS Church owns more than 100 stores in the U.S. and Canada called home storage centers, which are set up to sell all the bulk food and supplies for each Mormon family to stockpile enough for that coming Great Tribulation, essentially. In fact, the church is vertically integrated so as not to have to depend on any outside sources for food and supplies. They own the farms. They also own the food processing plants that provide the grain and beans and dried fruit that is sold at these church-owned stores. But with all that said, the church corporation and your average Mormon family, they're not super duper concerned with the impending second coming. Members aren't being encouraged to sell their houses or cash out their 401ks or really in any other way live their lives in a way that would suggest that the end is going to come in the next few months or even years. That said, there are some Mormons that are super interested in these types of prophecies. What's going to happen, when it will happen. And the interesting thing really is that in many ways, these are more aligned with the LDS Church as Joseph Smith originally set it up versus how the church is today. Smith moved all the church activities and headquarters out to Missouri in the 1830s so as to be closer to where all the action was going to be. And there's a good chunk of Mormons who feel that the LDS Church has maybe not apostatized exactly, but gotten away from its true roots, the way that the church should really be. It's interesting that as you look at it over the decades from the kind of the big picture view, the LDS Church has always focused its efforts to squash dissension from within on the more progressive or the more liberal elements of the church. They fought against members who have demanded equal rights for women, demanded women in the priesthood, people who wanted equal rights for Black and African American members, people who want equality for members who are gay or otherwise LGBTQ+. The church has spent money very freely over the years mounting campaigns against things like, for example, the proposed Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, which would have simply stated that women are equal to men. They spent millions more supporting California's Prop 8 in 2008, which would have banned same-sex marriage in the state. However, the LDS Church has never really spent any time or effort fighting members at the other end of the ideological spectrum, those who feel that the church has become too liberal, too progressive, and needs to return to those more conservative fundamentalist roots. This type of thinking has just been allowed to kind of germinate over the years. As a result, there's now these groups of members within the church that are really active in exploring these more fringy elements of Mormonism, end-times predictions, near-death experiences, having visions or personal revelations about topics that the church is generally silent about. So that's the overview of kind of what's been going on. Now let's look at some specific examples of people and events in this more edgy area of Mormonism. There's a lot of crazy stuff in the past 5 years, even in just the past year. So going back to Chad and Lori Daybell, they've become kind of key figures in this movement within the LDS Church. Chad had written a number of books about the end times and near-death experiences, and then Lori had quickly become fascinated with these concepts as well. Both of them were strong proponents of a 2012 book that was written by an LDS member titled Visions of Glory, One Man's Astounding Account of the Last Days. The author, using the pen name John Pontius, relates the end times visions of another Mormon using the pseudonym Spencer. Now, it's since been revealed that Spencer is actually a man named Tom Harrison. Tom Harrison was, as we mentioned, an LDS bishop, which is kind of the same as a coordinator of the body of elders for Jehovah's Witnesses. He works as a mental health therapist in Utah. And in addition to his own practice, he's an advisor to church headquarters on mental health issues for missionaries, for example. Well, since its publication in 2012, this book, Visions of Glory, has become really popular in certain LDS circles. If you look on Amazon, it has thousands of positive ratings. So, first of all, how does this book relate to the Chad and Lori Daybell murder spree? Well, the book explains that having a near-death experience is a key element, because once you've had that, an NDE, the veil is torn, as it were, and that enables you now to see visions and obtain knowledge from the other side that would otherwise be hidden. So Tom Harrison says that he's had a near-death experience, and that is the key to how he could have information about the coming events around the time of Jesus' second coming. The book also goes on to explain that souls can be light or dark, essentially good or evil, and that this normally invisible status can be seen and even rated on a scale by those whose veil has been torn. So Lori, who said she has had her own near-death experiences, became convinced that the souls of her children, Tylee and JJ, were extremely dark, that their true nature had become corrupted. In fact, essentially the true Tylee and JJ were gone completely, and what was left walking around was, for lack of a better word, zombies, just empty bodies that needed to be put down. And that's what she and Chad did. At her sentencing hearing, Lori explained that Tylee and JJ weren't dead. She described detailed visions she was having of her children in heaven, happily doing all the heaven things and smiling down on her and her actions. So we have this situation where certain members within the LDS Church have become essentially bored with the church's mainstream doctrines. They feel that the current church leaders have maybe strayed from the true church, and they're associating in these small groups of like-minded individuals, sharing all these books and theories about the future and near-death experiences they've had. There's a couple other elements common in these groups. One is an interest in, or an obsession with, really, prepping. It takes the level of prepping that the LDS Church wants all members to do and just cranks it up to 11. And so there's a lot of crossover with the wider prepper community in the United States. The general sense is that, just like Jesus said, those in Judea will need to flee to the mountains. Well, true believers will need to flee to rural mountain regions in the United States, often believed to be in Idaho. There's a statement purportedly made by Joseph Smith, although discredited by the LDS Church. It's called the White Horse Prophecy, and it states that there will come a time when the U.S. Constitution will be hanging by a thread, and an LDS leader who will become known as the White Horse will rise up from the Rocky Mountains and save the Constitution, and by extension, the nation as a whole. Now, the second major factor common in these LDS circles is being a Republican, conservative, typically a Trump supporter, and often passing around QAnon beliefs. I don't cover political things on this channel. I'm not starting now, but that's just the fact of the situation in these types of circles. The individuals say they've had near-death experiences, they're preppers, and they're Trump supporters. And again, Idaho comes up as an area that works well for all these things. It's one of the states in the American Redoubt, which is a part of the country that is promoted as being a safe haven for conservative Christians to move to and live in these times. It comprises Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, and the eastern parts of Oregon and Washington state. Idaho in particular has historically been home to a number of individuals suspicious of or against mainstream government. In 1992, there was the Ruby Ridge standoff in Naples, Idaho with Randy Weaver. In 2020, more recently, an Idaho LDS member named Ammon Bundy founded the People's Rights Network, a coalition which in 2021 was estimated to have about 30,000 people associated with it. The Institute for Research and Education of Human Rights, which is a watchdog organization on far-right, racist, and anti-Semitic groups in the United States, describes the People's Rights Network as being involved in, quote, troubling displays of far-right conspiracism, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-indigenous, and anti-transgender sentiment, and omnipresent threats of violence, end quote. Ammon Bundy has been involved in multiple armed standoffs with the government since 2014. More recently, in 2022, a couple in the People's Rights Network brought their 10-month-old baby to the hospital in Meridian, Idaho. The baby was found to be severely malnourished, and it remained at the hospital for several days of treatment. Bundy didn't like that the hospital kept the baby and attempted to forcibly take the baby from the hospital. He was arrested. He served 12 days in jail at that time. After his release, Bundy and his followers began targeting the hospital and its doctors and its nurses, doxing multiple employees, attempting to forcibly enter the hospital after the baby was kept a second time for treatment. They staged armed protests outside employees' houses. He claimed that the hospital, quote, engaged in widespread kidnapping, trafficking, and killing of Idaho children, end quote. There was a subsequent civil lawsuit, and Bundy and his organization were successfully sued for defamation and intentionally causing emotional distress. He was found guilty in July 2023. After that, Bundy fled the state. He's currently believed to be hiding in southern Utah with several outstanding arrest warrants. And by the way, he also ran for governor of Idaho as an independent in 2022, garnering more than 100,000 votes, which is not alarming at all, although he ultimately lost to the Republican incumbent. In another case from October 2023, an LDS mother from Arizona was arrested after kidnapping her 16-year-old son. I say kidnapping because his father had custody of the son, but she took him to Idaho with the boy's uncle and the boy's sister. And then from Idaho, they drove all the way to Alaska. they were stopped and arrested at the Alaska-Canada border. The three of them had emptied their family's bank accounts and purchased thousands of dollars of survival gear. They planned to live off the grid in the woods of Alaska for years if necessary. The mom and her family had become very obsessed with these end-times teachings and had become convinced that her son was a Davidic messenger, a Messiah figure prophesied to appear in the last days. So Tom Harrison, the author of that book, Visions of Glory, has become sort of a thought leader or mentor for many LDS members who circulate in these conservative circles. Some call them doomsday preppers for short. He's become this figure not only by people reading his book, but also by sharing his visions in meetings with groups of LDS members. There's a tradition in the Mormon Church of holding firesides, which are evening meetings generally held in an LDS church building, and there's a speaker there. So he would talk at these firesides. He would also meet personally with individual members. This brings us to Tim Ballard, another figure in these quote-unquote doomsday prepper circles. He is, or was, I guess, a prominent LDS member. He's most known for founding Operation Underground Railroad, which is an organization created to rescue children trapped in sex trafficking. There was a movie called Sound of Freedom released last year, 2023, which is an embellished account of Ballard's life. And Ballard moved in the same circles as many other Visions of Glory adherents, including speaking at conferences that Chad Daybell and others organized. Now, since the movie came out, multiple women have come forward accusing Ballard of sexual misconduct, and in a passage of court testimony from one of those lawsuits, the witness explained how Tim Ballard had told her that Tom Harrison had met with him, with Ballard, and had told him that Tim would become the prophet of the LDS Church, which is its top guy, as well as President of the United States of America. Now, in September 2023, Mitt Romney announced that he would not be running again as one of the U.S. senators from Utah, and it seemed like Tim Ballard was riding this wave where he was gearing up to announce that he would run for the Senate seat. But it was just a few weeks later that all the sexual misconduct lawsuits started to come out into the public, and that seems to have put the kibosh on his Senate run. It quickly came out that earlier in 2023, the OUR, the Operation Underground Railroad, had conducted its own internal investigation into Tim Ballard's conduct, which resulted in the end of him resigning from the organization that he had created. And then, although the LDS Church has been a heavy promoter of Tim Ballard and OUR over the years, they publicly denounced him, which was very surprising, specifically for using his connections and friendship with Mormon Apostle. A Mormon Apostle is basically like a governing body member. Friendship with Mormon Apostle M. Russell Ballard. They're actually not related. But information started to come out that the Apostle Ballard had passed tithing records to Tim Ballard so that he could target wealthy members to donate to OUR. And then Apostle Ballard died a few days later, leaving him unable to offer more information. Now, it does sound kind of fishy, but also he was 95 years old, so probably the church didn't have him killed to silence him. Since then, Tim Ballard has reportedly been excommunicated by the Mormon Church since those sexual misconduct allegations emerged. Now, there's another high-profile Republican and LDS member, Utah Attorney General Sean Reyes, who has also been implicated in this Tim Ballard OUR situation. Again, I'm not trying to specifically pick on Republicans. It's just that all the players in these Mormon circles are Republicans. In fact, OUR itself has come under scrutiny for kind of playing into QAnon conspiracy theories by overstating what's actually happening with child trafficking. In July 2023, Tim Ballard was interviewed by Jordan Peterson, and Ballard claimed, without evidence, of having recently raided a West African baby factory where children were being sold for organ harvesting and satanic ritual abuse, which is a QAnon claim. In a 2021 appearance to promote the Sound of Freedom movie, actor Jim Caviezel, who played Tim Ballard in the movie, said that Ballard was also supposed to be at the event, but he was saving victims of trafficking who were victims of adrenochroming, which is a fictional practice whose existence is, again, suggested by QAnon adherents. But anyways, getting back to Sean Reyes, he is a close friend of Ballard's. He's accompanied him on OUR raids, and at this time, several lawsuits have been filed accusing him of witness tampering and intimidation in regards to the OUR Tim Ballard lawsuits. In November 2023, the Utah legislature authorized a formal audit of Reyes' activities and of his relationship with Ballard. It's notable that other child trafficking advocates have been critical of what OUR actually accomplishes for children, notably Elizabeth Smart and her father Ed Smart. Both of them are LDS members. You might recall Elizabeth Smart was the girl kidnapped out of her bedroom in 2002 at age 14 to be a polygamous wife for a man that he had been LDS, although he had been excommunicated for claiming to be a prophet who could see visions. In 2014, the Smarts linked their child safeguarding foundation with OUR to kind of combine forces, but they quickly severed ties with the organization after Ed Smart went on an OUR raid and saw how it actually operated. Okay, so that's a lot of information. Hopefully that gives a pretty good overview of what's kind of going on in this Mormon doomsday prepper community. It kind of raises the question, why is all this happening? Why are so many LDS members getting into books like Visions of Glory, into end-times theology, prepperism, near-death experiences, all of that mixed with the conservative politics that many, not all, but many LDS members in the U.S. have? And they're not only getting into it, but believing this stuff so hard that it's even leading to kidnappings and murders. Why is this happening? And are similar factors at play among Jehovah's Witnesses today? Well, addressing the issue of why people are getting involved with all of this, one issue is LDS members disagreeing with church policies. Now, just as background, Utah Mormons were strongly pro-Trump in the 2020 election. Exit polls showed that of Mormons who voted, 72% voted for Trump. You might recall that the COVID vaccine began to become widely available in 2021. And so by August 2021, the LDS Church issued a statement telling members to wear masks and get the COVID-19 vaccine. Well, as you might imagine, that went over like a lead balloon with many of the more conservative members. And the church got heavy backlash from members fiercely opposed to the vaccine and to the church leaders telling them what to do. Some left the church over the issue. Some stuck with it, but they started to take a stance they never had before, feeling that, well, this is still the true church, but the apostles are not always right. Some things they say I can't ignore. And a similar thing happened for Jehovah's Witnesses. In June 2021, the congregation in announcements gave a number of reasons why witnesses should get vaccinated, although it stopped short of telling witnesses to do it. In August 2021, a letter was sent to all special full-time servants around the globe stating that the organization was requiring all of them to get vaccinated. And then in September 2021, a letter was sent to all bodies of elders stating that if any of them had been voicing opposition to the COVID vaccine, they needed to stop it immediately. Now, these written letters were being sent in tandem with multiple governing body video updates discussing why it would be good to get vaccinated.
There are many websites that promote conspiracy theories. If we are not careful, we could become emotionally involved in these debates. We could allow ourselves to be guided by the voice of strangers instead of listening to Jehovah's channel, The Faithful and Discreet Slave.
As that letter to the elders shows, there was a lot of resistance to getting vaccinated among Jehovah's Witnesses, just as there was among LDS members. If we look at one of the more popular internet forums for active Jehovah's Witnesses, in September 2021, the moderators were forced to start manually approving every post before it would appear in the site's news section due to all the anti-vax sentiments being posted. Again, this is by active Jehovah's Witnesses. They write, some members who have strong positions about vaccines are debating them fiercely, causing divisions and discomfort. These members often post false or twisted information from disreputable sources or even from very politically slanted media outlets. While we have no objection to sensible comments about the negative aspects of vaccines, we don't want this community to turn into a soapbox to spread ideas that contradict common sense or go against the instructions by the slave. Of course, being vaccinated or not is a personal choice that must be respected, but in the light of the above, we cannot tolerate this anti-vaccine crusade anymore. A number of longtime spiritually minded members are leaving our community because of the divisive atmosphere these arguments are creating. Many others are complaining that instead of the spiritually upbuilding discussions they used to have, all they find now are vaccine debates and political propaganda. This has to end. Now, we don't have numbers on how many, if any, Jehovah's Witnesses actually left the organization over this issue, but as it did with the Mormons, it did create a crack in the faith of some individuals. Again, that sentiment of, well, this is still the true religion, but in this particular instance, the brothers taking the lead are wrong, and I can decide the issue for myself. That's a very powerful feeling for a member of a high control group, and sometimes it can be a slippery slope to doubting other issues as well. So that's one issue that led some Mormons and witnesses away from always towing the organization line, disagreeing with official policies, specifically wearing masks and getting the COVID vaccine. Now, what's another issue? Well, for some LDS members, as we mentioned, the church is just getting a little boring. On the other hand, learning about and having near-death experiences and visions is very exciting. It feels like you're unlocking hidden knowledge, which is pretty cool. I think in many ways that's one of the things that attracted people to religions like the Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses in the first place. You know, as a witness or a Mormon, you feel like you have this underground knowledge about what's really going on in the world, and you're part of just this relatively small group that is able to possess this information. It makes you feel quite special. Now, I will say this bites both ways for the religion because, as we've seen with things like QAnon, members can feel like that's letting them get to the next extra secret level of knowledge, secrets inside of secrets. And if that secret knowledge conflicts with the less secret mainstream religion they're in, well, they might just choose that super special one. In some ways, the LDS Church's hands are tied because they can't start to promote the more fundamentalist visions of glory type things, because that would be returning to their more conservative Orthodox roots that they've spent almost 200 years trying to migrate away from. You know, polygamy is long gone in the religion. All members pooling their salaries together like they used to is gone. The ban on black men being elders is gone. So if they were to now reverse course and become that more hardcore conservative religion that Joseph Smith founded, well, they'd immediately lose the more progressive members, especially most of the young people that are currently growing up in the church. So they can't do that. On the other hand, become progressive too quickly, and they lose all the older conservative members who, by the way, are probably contributing most of the organization's money. And it's similar for Jehovah's Witnesses. Can you imagine if we were to return to those early roots of examining pyramids for insight into Bible prophecies, buying properties in San Diego, California, because Bible patriarchs would soon be resurrected and living there together as roommates? If the annual service report for the U.S. was split out into Caucasian publishers and black publishers, as it used to be? If we started picketing churches on Sunday mornings wearing sandwich boards that said religion is a snare and a racket? Well, boy, you'd quickly lose many witnesses who are very relieved that all those things are long gone in the pages of history. And on the other hand, if the governing body suddenly announced this year that women can now be elders, they can wear pants on the platform, that same-sex couples can be married in the Kingdom Hall, well, that's instantly going to turn off a lot of conservative witnesses. There was a really interesting interview on the Mormon Stories podcast just last week with a sociologist named Dr. Ryan Cragun. So he's a sociology professor. He also happens to be ex-Mormon and generally studies Mormonism and other religions in his job. And he discussed this catch-22 of not being able to modernize too quickly or too slowly. So I'm going to play a clip from this. It's about a minute or two long. For context, he's talking here about he was consulted by the Mormon Church headquarters, even as an ex-Mormon, to give a presentation on what sociological research is saying about how to keep religions like Mormonism going.
But one of the things I did tell them that I think we kind of now know is that conservative religions are doing the best, okay? And the reason why, and this is kind of weird to think about, is they're not aligned with modern values. And that's actually a good thing for the religion. I'm not saying it's a good thing generally, right? So, but if we're just thinking about religion surviving, if a religion is perfectly aligned with modern values that you might see through, media, through TV shows and movies, what's the benefit of staying in the religion? You might get some community, and that's great. And I'm not trying to dismiss that, right? But the values, you're not getting any reinforcement for any values you have because you get them elsewhere. But it's the people who don't have modern values who actually find support in religion. So let's say you're, we'll use a heterosexual family, right? But you're a wife or a husband in that family, and you think the wife should actually stay home and raise the kids. Where are you going to get validation for that in modern society? You're going to get that in conservative churches, right? Maybe you still have issues with lesbian, gay, or bisexual people. Where are you going to get validation for those views? You're going to get it in the conservative churches, right? So when you hold these more conservative views, you get validation for those views in conservative churches. And this is why I said the LDS church cannot afford to rapidly modernize. If they suddenly jettison all of their controversial views, they become a very progressive religion. What's the benefit of staying? Right? There's not a whole lot of utility in staying in the religion because it doesn't validate anything that you can't get from outside the religion. So the LDS Church actually has to, and Armin Moss is the one who really kind of proposed this back in the 1990s. The LDS Church has to walk this fine line of slowly modernizing, right, without trying to alienate the maximum number of people. They're always, by modernizing, they're going to alienate the conservatives, right? But they have to. But not modernizing fast enough, they're going to alienate the progressives. So they're constantly in this like slow progression towards the future, but never too fast. And they always have to stay behind the times, right? Otherwise, what's the utility of the religion? It's a weird way to think about it, but I described that to him and I was like, this is where you have to stay if you want to stay relevant to your members.
So I found this entire interview really interesting. I definitely listened to the whole thing as far as giving ideas about the future of Jehovah's Witnesses. Like Mormonism, the JW religion has to stay in this really narrow gray zone where they do modernize, but very gradually, and they always have to trail behind where society in general's values are. Modernize too quickly, they lose the conservatives. Modernize too slowly, they lose the progressive members. And as Dr. Cragun pointed out, this is what they need to do if their main goal is to retain as many members as possible. This is not what they should do if they want to do what's best for human society or what would prevent the most suicides. This strategy is solely for losing the least number of members. The other point I found interesting that he said is that conservative religions are doing the best at retaining members. If religions adopt modern values, there's not so much point staying in the religion because it's not providing you with utility other than maybe community, which can certainly be nice. But if validation for your values is found just about everywhere you go in the community, then it's no longer quite as compelling to have to go to the meeting twice a week to hear about those values. So in that sense, it becomes a little dangerous for Jehovah's Witness headquarters to make changes like allowing beards and saying that maybe people can start serving Jehovah in the 11th hour deep into the Great Tribulation right before Armageddon. Those things make the religion more palatable, but it also makes it less unique. You don't feel quite as special anymore if it starts to become fairly similar to a lot of the other churches in town. Compounding this is the depersonalization of the religion that we're seeing, the shift to everything being controlled centrally from headquarters. There's been several good posts on this trend in Reddit in the past week or two. In the past decades, you definitely get plenty of directions from the society, but the religion was really created at the local grassroots level. People wrote their own talks. They built their own kingdom halls. Each congregation had its own personality, for better or worse. At congregation book studies and houses, you could kind of let your hair down a little and really get to know your brothers and sisters in a slightly more informal setting. But in the last decade, kind of the JW broadcasting era, this shift in culture has happened fairly rapidly. Kingdom halls are now owned by the society. You just show up to the building that they provide you, and then instead of creating the meeting program with the others in your congregation, you largely just sit there now and listen to what is played on the screen for you from New York. The talks that do exist are shorter and more scripted, allowing for less creativity. One Reddit poster put it, "We've gone from feeling like part of a commune to feeling like office workers." We see these many changes in policies and rules that seem designed more to shield headquarters from liability and protect the bottom line, rather than make it a special and spiritual experience for members. And while the governing body frequently states on JW Broadcasting how much they love the dear friends,
dear brothers and sisters, we love you all very much.
The actions they're taking, that increased control and centralization of the religion, speak much louder than their words about how the governing body actually feels about congregation publishers. And so this brings us to former governing body member Anthony Morris. We know he was a man with very definite opinions on what a good witness looks like, which kind of makes people wonder, was he not in agreement with the changes recently introduced in the religion, such as men being able to wear beards? Did he disagree with the idea that the start of the Great Tribulation might not be the cutoff for joining Jehovah's Witnesses? It certainly seems like a possibility. Is that why he's no longer on the governing body?
We don't know.
As we've talked about, the trouble for the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses, as with the LDS Church, is they're not just losing members by not being liberal enough. They're also losing the adherence of members by not being conservative enough, by changing too many doctrines and policies from what they've been for decades. So if that's why Anthony Morris left, it's safe to say he's not the only witness who thinks that elders and circuit overseers shouldn't have beards, who disagrees with the drop in the pioneer hour requirements, or the idea that publishers don't need to turn in time anymore. As we saw from that September 2021 letter, there was plenty of congregation elders who disagreed with the organization when it said everyone should get vaccinated. We hear constant admonition from the organization to avoid apostates that leave the organization. But maybe the real question should be, is the current governing body apostatizing from what true religion is? And there's biblical precedent for this idea. In Bible times, Israel was God's one true organization on earth, and the king of Israel, along with the high priest, was head of that organization. But was every high priest faithful to Jehovah? Definitely not. Sometimes reading the Bible, it seems like there was more unfaithful kings than faithful ones. So, granting for the moment that the Bible account is literal history, as Jehovah's Witnesses believe, then for Joe Schmo Israelite living under one of those unfaithful kings, he had a decision to make. Would he follow the lead of that unfaithful king who was worshiping at the high places and marrying foreign wives? Or would he go against the king to worship Jehovah as he knew was right? Would he conclude that the king, the man visibly taking the lead in Jehovah's earthly organization, had apostatized from Jehovah? So I need to break from following him and do what I think and understand is right based on listening to the Mosaic Law and other scriptures. To do that would be a very tough call. When we read the Bible accounts today, the time frame is really compressed. In one chapter we read that there was an unfaithful king, and then maybe his son was unfaithful, and so on. And then maybe in a couple hundred years, 2 or 3 chapters later, Jehovah brings judgment on them, and maybe the nation is conquered by a foreign power for a while. So that all sounds very reasonable, but we're looking at it from this bird's eye view high in the sky. For Joe Schmo Israelite on the ground, he could live his entire lifetime and nothing happens to this apostate king. There's no judgment from Jehovah. Maybe a prophet went to censure the king, but how would the average Israelite even know that happened? It's not like it was getting broadcast on the evening news. So from his perspective, it could appear that, maybe this is just how it is right now in Jehovah's organization. Jehovah doesn't seem to mind that the king is worshiping at both the high places and the temple simultaneously. This direction I'm getting from God's organization seems strange and illogical, but it's the direction from his appointed representatives, so I probably shouldn't show an independent spirit by questioning it too much. I'll just leave the matter in Jehovah's hands and he can clear it up later. That, by far, would be the easier road to go. Or would he decide that, nope, this direction from Jehovah's appointed representatives is not right. I need to serve Jehovah according to the accurate knowledge I've learned from the scriptures, although that may be contrary to what the organization is telling me. So I don't have any insider information, but that may well be what we're seeing play out in the organization right now with Anthony Morris, and another figure to think about is Rolf Heruli. In case you're not already familiar with Heruli, he is a Norwegian witness. He's about 80 years old. He served as an elder, a circuit overseer, and he was for a time a district overseer as well. Later on in his life, he went to college. He finished his master's degree at 52 and his PhD at age 62. He taught at the University of Oslo. It's interesting, for many years, he was kind of the alter ego or nemesis of a Swedish ex-witness named Carl Olaf Jonsson. In the late 60s, one of Janssen's Bible students asked him whether the 1914 chronology of Jehovah's Witnesses is actually accurate. And his research into the answer would end up taking him almost 10 years. In the end, he concluded that Jerusalem did not fall in 607 BCE as Jehovah's Witnesses teach, which in turn throws off the whole Bible chronology pointing to 1914. Well, Janssen wrote up his findings and he sent them to Watchtower headquarters in 1977, where his paper was roundly rejected, and he was warned not to share his research with anybody else. In fact, he was disfellowshipped in 1982. And in 1983, he published his findings in a book titled The Gentile Times Reconsidered. In the subsequent decades after that, Rolf Feruli and Karl Olaf Janssen battled back and forth publishing academic papers, Feruli defending the Watchtower position that Jerusalem fell in 607, and Janssen arguing against that. Feruli is he's probably the only apologist Jehovah's Witnesses have had in their corner, since the overwhelming scholarly consensus is that Jerusalem fell in 587 BCE. So Feruli has a long and distinguished career as a zealous Jehovah's Witness. However, in recent years, Feruli became increasingly alarmed by the direction the governing body was taking the religion. He eventually wrote his concerns in book form, and as seems to be protocol, he sent it off to the governing body, with the comment that if they would correct the issues, he would not publish his book. Well, they rejected that offer from Scandinavia as well, and in 2020 he published the book titled My Beloved Religion and the Governing Body. Later that year, he was disfellowshipped. He points out on his website that none of the elders on his judicial committee had read or even seen the book he'd published. As with that example of an Israelite living under an apostate king, Feruli does not believe that the religion itself of Jehovah's Witnesses is wrong. He writes on his website, I believe that Jehovah God has used the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society from the days of C.T. Russell to restore the only true religion, and that all the doctrines of Jehovah's Witnesses are based on the Bible. I do not want to harm Jehovah's Witnesses, which is my beloved religion. But the lives of tens of thousands of my brothers and sisters have been ruined by the unbiblical laws and rules created by the governing body. I cannot just close my eyes to this injustice, and therefore I have written the mentioned book and have created this web page. So if disagreeing with the decisions the governing body is making is the reason Anthony Morris is no longer on the governing body, it's hard to imagine that he's the only Bethelite that feels that way, or that Rolf Feruli is the only witness in Norway to have these concerns about the organization. You know, in Mormonism, we saw that groups have coalesced around thought leaders such as Tom Harrison and his book, Visions of Glory. It's entirely possible that we may start to see splinter groups or schisms form around individuals like Anthony Morris or Rolf Feruli, being joined by other witnesses who similarly feel that, while this is still the true religion, the men on the governing body are not making decisions based on Bible principles in the direction of Jehovah's Holy Spirit. One indicator that some witnesses are deciding various spiritual matters for themselves may possibly be seen in the increase in the number of memorial partakers each year. In 2007, the May 1st Watchtower stated that we can't definitively say that virtually all anointed were called by 1935, as had long been taught. And since then, the number of partakers has risen every year, except in 2020 when COVID first flared up. In 2023, there were 22,312 partakers, up another 1,162 from 2022. Each of those 1,000-plus witnesses know the Watchtower teaching that virtually all Jehovah's Witnesses alive today have the earthly hope. But after reading the Bible, thinking prayerfully about it, they each came to the conclusion that they are a born-again Christian going to heaven, which admittedly is not a hard conclusion to come to by reading the New Testament. It's the same conclusion that another governing body member reached that left, Raymond Franz, author of Crisis of Conscience, along with his wife Cynthia. Franz was disfellowshipped in 1981. Others in this camp include the couple Nestor and Tony Cuilan, authors of a memoir published in Spanish, Finalmente Libres, Las Memorias de Nestor y Tony Cuilan. They were Gilead missionaries in Spain, and Nestor was a district overseer there after a while. Eventually, they were reassigned to Brooklyn Bethel, And after discussing the Bible with Ray Franz while at Bethel, Nestor was disfellowshipped for covering over apostasy when he refused to divulge their conversations. Another from that 1980s time period is Dr. James Penton, author of Apocalypse Delayed, a comprehensive history of Jehovah's Witnesses. Along with being a history professor in Alberta, Canada, Penton was a fourth-generation witness, an elder, and a memorial partaker. In 1979, he wrote an 8-page letter to the Society about his doctrinal concerns. The letter also circulated among witnesses in Lethbridge, Alberta, where he lived. He was ultimately disfellowshipped for apostasy in 1981. His disfellowshipping actually triggered a schism in Lethbridge with approximately 80 witnesses, about a quarter of the local members, either disassociating or being disfellowshipped. The events surrounding his expulsion made national news in Canada. By 1982, the situation had progressed to the point that Watchtower President Fred Franz personally flew to Calgary and gave 2 talks about apostasy, each several hours in length, to witnesses at a local auditorium which seats about 2,500 people. Bringing it down to our day, a current example of a splinter group that is formed is Eric Wilson and the Berean Pickets group at Bereans.net. Like James Penton, Wilson is also Canadian. I tell you, the Watchtower Society, they need to watch out for their Canadian members. They're very polite people, but when they do finally get mad, they're a feisty bunch for sure. But yeah, Eric Wilson was born into the religion, and he too was very active. He spent a number of years preaching where the need was great down in South America. And although he had noticed issues in the organization over the years, mainly issues to do with individuals and how the organization functioned, he was a firm believer in the doctrine that this is God's one true religion on earth. However, in 2010, the organization released the new Overlapping Generations teaching. At the time, Wilson was the coordinator of the body of elders in his congregation in Canada, and this new teaching immediately struck him as just a zany, made-up doctrine that's not based on any Bible scriptures. And after that small crack, he began to carefully compare other Jehovah's Witness doctrines with what the Bible taught. He began discussing things with a few other like-minded witnesses, much as Ray Franz did in his post-witness life, and Wilson was eventually disfellowshipped in 2019. The group that coalesced from those discussions meets every Sunday on Zoom to discuss various Bible passages, and anyone can attend. In fact, Dr. James Penton has published a number of articles on the Berean Pickets website. Looking at the site's What We Believe section, there are a number of similarities to witness doctrines, such as no Trinity or hellfire, but many of the teachings unique to Jehovah's Witnesses have been discarded, such as those having to do with Bible prophecies, or that some Christians have an earthly hope and some have a heavenly hope. Just like Ray and Cynthia Franz came to believe, Berean Pickets accepts the main gist of the New Testament, that all Christians go to heaven, and thus all are partakers in the memorial's bread and wine. Now, I'm not sure Eric Wilson would like me characterizing his group as a splinter group or a schism of Jehovah's Witnesses. I think rather they'd probably say that they have left Jehovah's Witnesses behind, and they're not a new group or a new religion at all. They're just people who get together and study the Bible together. And I think that's fair to say too. But it is indicative that there are plenty of witnesses who are dissatisfied with the organization and are willing to ditch it for something they feel is truer, is closer to how God should be worshipped. So, will we see Anthony Morris emerge in coming years as the unofficial leader of a schism meeting down in North Carolina? Will Rolf Feruli lead a revolt of the 12,000 witnesses in Norway? Will a governing body member be forced to travel to Scandinavia and try to put down the rebellion, just as Fred Franz traveled to Calgary, Alberta 40 years ago? Will we see some witnesses get bored with the official theology and drift deeper into speculation about the last days? Will some of those new memorial partakers feel that they're receiving direction from Jehovah to start making more intense preparations for the last days? Feeling that perhaps with the upcoming presidential election, that the fall of the United States may be imminent, or at least a collapse in the economy and much of a civilized American society as we know it, leading directly into the Great Tribulation? Will some witnesses thus get deeply into prepping, maybe moving to Idaho or another area of the American redoubt? Watchtower literature already paints a post-Armageddon picture of life off the grid, kind of a peaceful agrarian lifestyle, undisturbed by modern technology and its concerns. Taking one's family to rural Idaho or Montana could just be viewed as getting a jump start on living in the new system. Well, all I can say is I'm really curious to see where things go for Jehovah's Witnesses in the next few years. The only prediction I really feel safe making is that it's going to be unpredictable. I think we're going to see stuff we never would have expected. So stay tuned. Well, that's about it for today. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you like to, and we'll catch y'all in the next video. Take care now.